The snow fell softly over the bustling city of New York, coating the streets in a pristine white layer that glimmered under the glow of festive lights. Inside a towering glass skyscraper, Charles Whitaker sat in his spacious office, its minimalist decor a stark contrast to the warmth radiating outside. The faint hum of holiday music drifted in from the streets below, but Charles hardly noticed. His focus remained on the conference call playing through the speakers of his desk. Numbers are up this quarter, a voice declared with enthusiasm, but Charles's response was distant and automatic, a series of clipped affirmations meant to keep the conversation moving. His assistant appeared in the doorway, holding a silver tray with a cup of coffee. She hesitated for a moment, noticing his furrowed brow. "Mr. Whitaker," she began tentatively, "your mother called again. She asked if—" "Tell her I'll call her later," Charles interrupted, not looking up from his screen. The assistant nodded silently and retreated, her steps barely audible over the thick carpeting. The truth was, Charles had no intention of returning the call. His mother, Martha, had become a persistent reminder of a life he'd worked hard to leave behind. Her cozy house in Asheville, North Carolina, with its creaking floorboards and cluttered shelves, was a world apart from the sleek, controlled environment he now inhabited. She called several times that week, insisting he come home for Christmas. Each time, Charles had made excuses, meetings, deadlines, flights. There was always something more pressing. As the call ended, Charles leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The holidays always brought a certain pressure he resented. Everyone expected something from him. Employees, business partners, the charity boards he reluctantly served on. And then there was his mother, with her gentle reminders about traditions and family. But he had moved on from all that. Or so he told himself. That evening, as he prepared to leave the office, Charles's phone buzzed. The screen lit up with his mother's name. He hesitated before swiping to answer. "Hi, Mom," he said, his tone guarded. "Charles," Martha's voice was soft, tinged with a weariness he didn't notice. "I just wanted to check if you'll be coming. I've got the old ornaments out, and I thought we could—" "I'm sorry, Mom." He cut her off, his words firm but not unkind. "Things are hectic here. I'll try to visit after the holidays." There was a pause on the other end. "I understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Take care, Charles." He ended the call quickly, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat of his car as he drove through the city streets. The buildings around him glittered with holiday cheer, but Charles kept his gaze fixed ahead. He had done what he thought was right, choosing his responsibilities over nostalgia. There was no room for sentimentality in his world. When he arrived at his penthouse, the space felt colder than usual, despite the state-of-the-art heating system. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat by the large window overlooking the city. Somewhere below, families gathered, couples strolled hand in hand, and laughter spilled out of cafes. He watched the snow falling in steady flakes, feeling a pang of something he couldn't quite name. But as quickly as it came, he brushed it aside. Sentiment was a distraction, and distractions were a luxury he couldn't afford. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a blur of meetings and negotiations. On the morning of December 26th, Charles's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. Thinking it might be business-related, he answered. "Mr. Whitaker?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, belonging to an older man. "This is Jacob. I own the antique shop on Main Street in Asheville. Your mother used to stop by now and then." Charles frowned, unsure where this was going. "How can I help you?" I wasn't sure if I should call, but I came across something of hers. A brooch. Looked like it might be important. A little girl came into my shop with it. She said it belonged to her grandmother." The words landed with an unexpected weight. "What do you mean?" Charles asked, his voice sharper than intended. "My mother is fine. She's at home." Jacob hesitated. "I don't think so, sir. People around town are saying she hasn't been seen since Christmas Eve." Charles gripped the edge of his desk, his mind racing. This was a mistake, he told himself. His mother was probably fine. Probably just, what? He couldn't finish the thought. "Send me a photo of the brooch," he ordered. Within moments, his phone buzzed again, and the image appeared on the screen. His heart sank. The brooch was unmistakable, an intricate silver piece in the shape of a snowflake, studded with tiny pearls. It had belonged to his grandmother and had been passed down to his mother. She never took it off, not even for a moment. Charles stared at the photo, the world around him fading into a blur. For the first time in years, he felt something crack through the icy walls he had built around himself. Charles could hardly breathe as he stared at the photo of the brooch. The intricate snowflake design, the tiny pearls gleaming against the silver, brought a rush of memories. He remembered his mother wearing it every Christmas, her hands smoothing over its surface as if it carried all her hopes and dreams. His throat tightened, and for the first time in years, his confidence wavered. He called Jacob back immediately. "Where is the girl now?" he demanded, his tone sharper than he intended. "She's been staying at the church shelter, off Main Street," Jacob said cautiously. "Reverend Hall has been looking out for her. She's a sweet kid, but," Jacob hesitated, "she seems scared, like she doesn't trust anyone." Charles muttered a quick thank you and ended the call. Within the hour, he was on a flight to Asheville, his usual first-class seat feeling cramped and uncomfortable despite its luxury. The hum of the engines did little to calm the storm brewing in his chest. For years, he had convinced himself that leaving Asheville, and the memories tied to it, was the right decision. Now, the thought of returning filled him with a mix of dread and urgency. The plane landed in the early evening, and the crisp mountain air bit at his face as he exited the terminal. The town was just as he remembered, blanketed in snow and shimmering with Christmas lights that lined the streets. But there was no time to linger on nostalgia. Charles rented a car and drove directly to the church. The shelter was modest, its exterior adorned with a simple nativity scene. Inside, the warm glow of candles lit the space, casting soft shadows across the pews. A handful of people sat in quiet conversations, their voices low. Charles approached an older man near the entrance, assuming he was Reverend Hall. "Reverend, I'm Charles Whitaker," he said, extending a hand. "I was told there's a girl here, the one with my mother's brooch." Reverend Hall looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Ah, you must be talking about Lily," he said, his voice kind but firm. "She's been through a lot. What exactly is your interest in her?" "My mother is missing," Charles explained, his voice trembling slightly. "The brooch she had, it's hers. I need to know where Lily got it. She might be the only one who can help me find my mother." The Reverend nodded slowly, as if weighing Charles's words. "Lily is in the back room. But go easy on her, Mr. Whitaker. She doesn't trust strangers, and with good reason." Charles followed him to a small room at the rear of the church. Inside, a girl no older than 10 sat cross-legged on a cot, clutching a threadbare stuffed rabbit. Her dark eyes widened as she saw them enter, her grip on the toy tightening. "Lily," the Reverend said gently, "this is Mr. Whitaker. He's here to talk about the brooch you found." Charles stepped forward cautiously, his tall frame almost too imposing for the tiny room. He crouched slightly to meet Lily's gaze. "Hi, Lily," he said, softening his tone. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need to know about the brooch. It belonged to my mother." Lily studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she pulled the brooch from the pocket of her oversized coat. "She gave it to me," Lily said quietly, her voice trembling. "She said it would keep me safe." Charles felt a lump rise in his throat. "When did she give it to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "On Christmas Eve," Lily said. "She found me by the park. It was so cold, and I didn't have anywhere to go. She told me to come here, to Reverend Hall. She said she'd come back for me." The words hit Charles like a punch to the gut. His mother, frail and elderly, had been wandering alone on Christmas Eve, finding a lost child and offering her comfort while he sat in his penthouse, ignoring her calls. He fought back the rising tide of guilt and focused on Lily. "Did she say where she was going?" he asked, desperate for answers. Lily shook her head. "She just hugged me and said I'd be safe here. Then she left." Charles ran a hand through his hair, frustration mingling with fear. "Lily, I need to find her. Anything you remember. Anything at all," could help. The girl hesitated, then reached into her coat again and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "She gave me this," she said. "I don't know what it means." Charles took the paper and unfolded it. His breath caught as he recognized his mother's handwriting. The note was brief, almost cryptic. "The snow will guide you. Trust the light." "What does this mean?" he asked aloud, more to himself than to anyone else. Reverend Hall, who had been silently observing, spoke up. "There's a park near the edge of town where the snow reflects the starlight in a way that looks almost magical. It's a place people go to think, to find peace." Maybe she meant there. Charles didn't wait. He thanked the Reverend and asked him to keep Lily safe while he searched. The park wasn't far, and as he drove through the quiet streets, the weight of his choices bore down on him. His mother had been trying to reach him, not just physically but emotionally, and he had ignored her at every turn. When he arrived at the park, the snow shimmered under the moonlight, creating an otherworldly glow. He called out her name, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Mom, are you here?" There was no answer, only the sound of the wind rustling through the bare trees. Charles trudged through the snow, his breath visible in the freezing air. Then, in the distance, he saw something. Footprints, faint but distinct, leading toward a small bench near a frozen pond. As he followed them, his heart pounded with both hope and fear. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't leave this place without her. Charles followed the faint trail of footprints, his steps crunching through the undisturbed snow. The bitter cold bit at his face, but he hardly noticed. Each step felt heavier, not just from the snow, but from the weight of his own guilt. He hadn't realized until now how deeply he'd buried the parts of himself that once cared, that once understood what family meant. As he approached the bench near the frozen pond, his heart sank. The footprints ended abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. He scanned the area, the stillness almost unbearable. A sliver of moonlight illuminated the icy surface of the pond, and something glinted faintly near the edge. He hurried closer, crouching down to examine what caught his eye. It was a mitten, small and knitted, with a pattern he instantly recognized. His mother had made it herself years ago. He held it tightly, his breath catching in his throat. This was her mitten. She had been here. "Mom!" he called out again, his voice echoing across the empty park. There was no reply, only the soft rustle of wind through the trees. He felt the icy pang of fear tighten its grip on his chest. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, the mitten clutched in his hand, before he heard footsteps crunching in the snow behind him. "Mr. Whitaker?" It was Reverend Hall, his lantern casting a warm glow against the darkness. Lily was worried. "She thought you might need help." Charles straightened, his expression a mixture of relief and frustration. "I found this," he said, holding up the mitten. "She was here, but I don't know where she went." Reverend Hall nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "This park is big, but there's a trail that leads up to the old chapel on the hill. It's a quiet place, one she might have gone to if she was seeking peace." Charles didn't hesitate. He handed the mitten to the Reverend and started toward the trail, his determination growing with each step. The path was narrow and winding, bordered by tall, snow-covered trees that seemed to close in around him. The climb was steep, and his breath came in short, visible puffs, but he didn't stop. As he neared the top of the hill, the chapel came into view, its small wooden structure almost glowing in the moonlight. He pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The space was simple, with rows of wooden pews and a single stained glass window depicting an angel. In the center of the room, illuminated by the flickering light of a candle, sat Martha. She was bundled in her old coat, her frame smaller and frilier than he remembered. Her hands rested in her lap, clutching a small photo frame. When she looked up and saw him, her expression shifted from surprise to something softer, almost wistful. "Charles," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You came." He stood frozen for a moment, taking in the sight of her. She looked so fragile, so tired, and he realized just how much he had taken her presence for granted. Slowly, he approached her, sinking to his knees beside the pew. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I should have come sooner. I should have. She raised a hand, resting it gently on his cheek. Hush, Charles, she said. You're here now. That's what matters. Tears stung his eyes, and he blinked them away, ashamed of how deeply he had failed her. He glanced at the photo she held. It was of their family, taken years ago. His father, long gone, stood smiling beside Martha, while a younger Charles looked on with the wide-eyed curiosity of a boy who believed the world was full of endless possibilities. I thought I'd lost you, he said, his voice trembling. When I heard you were missing, I didn't know what to do. Martha sighed, her breath visible in the cold air. I wasn't lost, Charles. I was waiting for you to remember what's important. Her words cut through him like a knife, but they weren't said with malice. She wasn't angry. She was just tired. He reached for her hand, holding it tightly between his own. Mom, he said earnestly, I want to make it right. I don't want to lose you. I'll do whatever it takes. Martha smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with tears. You don't need to do anything but be here. That's all I ever wanted. For a moment, they sat in silence, the warmth of their shared presence filling the small chapel. Outside, the snow continued to fall, its gentle hush blanketing the world in peace. Finally, Charles spoke again. There's a little girl, he said. Lily. She said you found her on Christmas Eve. Martha's smile grew, and there was a flicker of pride in her eyes. She reminded me of you, Charles. Lost, but full of so much potential. She needed someone to show her that she wasn't alone. Charles nodded, understanding. She's at the church now, safe. She told me how you helped her. I'll look after her. I promise. Martha's grip on his hand tightened slightly, and her expression softened further. That's good, Charles. That's very good. The candle flickered, its light growing dimmer. Charles felt his mother's hand grow still in his own, her breathing slowing. Panic surged in his chest, but before he could speak, she whispered her final words. Keep the light, Charles. Let it guide you. And then, she was gone. Charles sat there for a long time, holding her hand as tears streamed down his face. The candle burned out completely, leaving the chapel bathed in the pale glow of moonlight. He felt the weight of her absence, but also the warmth of her love lingering in the air. Finally, he stood, lifting the photo frame she had held so tightly. He walked out into the snow, his heart heavier but his resolve stronger than ever. It was time to honor her memory, not with grand gestures, but with the simple act of being present, for Lily, for himself, and for the world she had always believed he could change. Charles descended the hill with slow, deliberate steps, the frosty air biting at his cheeks. The photo frame his mother had held so dearly was now tucked safely into his coat, its weight a poignant reminder of the night's events. His thoughts churned as he replayed her final words, her voice resonating in his mind. Keep the light, Charles. Let it guide you. She had always spoken in ways that carried layers of meaning, and now, in her absence, he felt an urgent need to understand what she had truly meant. The church came into view below, its warm glow cutting through the cold night. As he approached, Reverend Hall was standing by the door, his lantern casting long shadows on the snow-covered ground. Charles nodded in silent acknowledgement, his grief too fresh for words. Inside, Lily sat on one of the pews, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She looked up as he entered, her small face a mixture of apprehension and hope. Is she okay? Lily asked quietly, her voice trembling. Charles knelt down beside her, his heart heavy as he met her gaze. She's gone, Lily, he said, his voice breaking. But she wanted me to tell you something. She said you're not alone anymore. Lily's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her little hand gripping the rabbit tightly. Charles felt a pang of responsibility he hadn't expected, a pull to protect this child who had been entrusted to him by his mother. He reached out hesitantly, resting a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure this out together, he said. You and me. Lily stared at him for a moment, then gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Charles stood, glancing at Reverend Hall, who watched the exchange with quiet approval. Thank you, Charles said to the Reverend. For keeping her safe. Reverend Hall smiled gently. It's what your mother would have wanted. She had a way of seeing the good in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. Charles felt the weight of those words settle on him. He had spent so much of his life running from who he was, from the connections that had once grounded him. And now, in the span of a single night, everything had shifted. His mother's love had been steadfast, unwavering, even as he had distanced himself. And now, she was gone. He turned back to Lily. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go home." The drive to his mother's house was quiet, the silence between them filled with unspoken emotions. Lily sat in the passenger seat, her small hands clutching the photo frame he had given her to hold. Charles glanced at her occasionally, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to this, to comforting someone, to being vulnerable. But something about Lily, her resilience and quiet strength, stirred something in him. When they arrived at the house, the sight of it hit Charles harder than he expected. The modest home, with its snow-dusted roof and dim porch light, seemed to glow with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the emptiness he felt. He unlocked the door and guided Lily inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards echoing through the quiet space. Lily hesitated in the doorway, her gaze darting around the room. "Is this where she lived?" she asked softly. Charles nodded. "Yeah, she loved this house," said it reminded her of the things that mattered. Lily wandered to the mantel, where an assortment of photos and trinkets were carefully arranged. Her small fingers traced the edge of a framed picture of Charles as a boy, sitting on his mother's lap. He felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched her, the weight of the past pressing down on him. "She talked about you," Lily said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. "She said you were smart and strong, that you'd do big things." Charles blinked, his chest tightening. "She said that?" Lily nodded, still looking at the photo. "She always said you'd come back. She believed in you." He turned away, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. His mother had believed in him, even when he had given her every reason not to. He walked into the kitchen, needing a moment to collect himself. The space was just as he remembered it, simple, homey, with the faint scent of cinnamon lingering in the air. He found a kettle and began to make tea, the mundane task grounding him in the present. Lily appeared in the doorway, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. "Do you think she's happy now?" she asked hesitantly. Charles set the kettle down and turned to her. "I think she's at peace," he said, his voice steady. "She did what she always wanted to do. She helped people. She made a difference." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I want to do that too," she said quietly. "I want to help people." Charles felt a swell of emotion at her words. This little girl, who had been through so much, was still thinking about others. It was humbling. "You will, Lily," he said. "You already have." They sat at the kitchen table, the warm tea offering a small comfort against the cold night. For the first time in what felt like forever, Charles allowed himself to sit in the quiet, to feel the grief and the love that came with it. He looked at Lily, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair, and felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. "We're going to stay here for a while," he said, more to himself than to her. "There's work to be done." Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide. "What kind of work?" Charles smiled faintly. "The kind that makes a difference. The kind she would have been proud of." Lily nodded, her expression serious. "Okay," she said. "I'll help." Charles reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We'll do it together," he said. In that moment, surrounded by the echoes of his mother's love and the quiet determination of a little girl, Charles felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a grand revelation, but a quiet promise, a light rekindled, guiding him forward. The morning came quietly, the pale sunlight filtering through the lace curtains in Martha's living room. Charles woke early, his body stiff from sleeping on the old sofa. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes as the memories of the previous night washed over him. For a brief moment, he hoped it had all been a dream, that he'd find his mother bustling around the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared breakfast. But the silence in the house was deafening, and the absence of her familiar presence was a painful reminder of the reality he now faced. Lily was still asleep in the guest room, her small form barely visible beneath the quilt his mother had likely stitched years ago. Charles peeked in to check on her before heading to the kitchen. He moved carefully, opening cabinets and drawers, noting the organized chaos that defined his mother's way of keeping things. He found a box of oatmeal and set about making breakfast, the simple act grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. As he stirred the pot on the stove, his mind wandered to the night before. His mother's words lingered, and he felt the weight of her quiet expectations. Keep the light. Let it guide you. He wasn't entirely sure what she had meant, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had let himself drift over the years. His success, his wealth, they had come at a cost he was only now beginning to understand. When Lily appeared in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep, Charles offered her a tentative smile. "Morning," he said. "I made oatmeal. It's not much, but it's warm." She nodded and shuffled to the table, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice still thick with sleep. They ate in silence at first, the faint clink of spoons against bowls the only sound in the room. Charles stole glances at Lily, trying to piece together her story. She was so small, so quiet. Yet there was a resilience in her that reminded him of his mother. He didn't know much about children, but he knew enough to recognize that Lily had been through more than most. After breakfast, Charles cleared the table and turned to her. "Lily," he began carefully, "can you tell me a little about yourself? Where you're from, how you ended up here?" She looked down at her rabbit, her fingers fidgeting with its ears. "I don't really remember where I'm from," she said after a moment. "My mom, she got sick, and then it was just me. I tried to stay with some people, but they didn't want me around. Then I started coming to the church. Your mom, she was nice. She found me." Charles felt a pang of guilt at her words. His mother, even in her old age and with so little herself, had taken care of this child when no one else would. He wondered if he would have had the courage to do the same if their roles were reversed. "Well," he said, his voice firm but kind, "you don't have to worry about that anymore. You'll stay here with me. We'll figure things out together." Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Really?" "Yes," Charles said. "Really." For the first time since he'd met her, Lily smiled. It was small and fleeting, but it was there, and it lit something inside him that he hadn't felt in years. He decided then and there that he wouldn't let her down. She deserved a chance at a better life, and he owed it to his mother to make that happen. The rest of the day was spent sorting through his mother's belongings. Charles and Lily worked side by side, packing boxes and carefully setting aside items that held special meaning. It was a bittersweet task, filled with moments of laughter as they unearthed old photos and trinkets, and moments of quiet reflection as they came across things that spoke to the life Martha had lived. By mid-afternoon, Charles found himself holding a stack of his mother's journals. He sat down at the kitchen table, flipping through the pages. Her neat handwriting filled the lined paper, recounting everything from grocery lists to deeply personal thoughts. As he read, he began to piece together parts of her life he had never taken the time to understand. Her hopes, her fears, and, most of all, her unwavering love for him. One entry caught his eye, dated just a few weeks before Christmas. "I know Charles is busy, and I don't blame him for it. He's worked so hard to build his life. But I wish he could see how proud I am of him, how much I still believe in him. I know he's forgotten how to slow down, how to look for the light, but I haven't given up. I never will." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He closed the journal and sat back, the enormity of her love and faith in him sinking in. He had spent so much time running from the past, from the connections that had once defined him, but his mother had never stopped believing he would find his way back. Lily appeared beside him, her small hand resting on his arm. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. Charles nodded, wiping his eyes. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick. I miss her." Lily nodded solemnly. "Me too." They sat together in the quiet for a long moment, the weight of their shared loss binding them in a way Charles hadn't expected. It wasn't the family he had envisioned for himself, but it was a family nonetheless. And as he looked at Lily, her small frame silhouetted by the fading afternoon light, He realized that this was his chance to honor his mother's legacy, not by clinging to the past, but by building something new. "Lily," he said finally, his voice steady, "we're going to make this place our home, and we're going to do something good with it. Something she would have loved." Lily nodded again, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. "Okay," she said, "I'd like that." For the first time in years, Charles felt a sense of purpose. It wasn't about rebuilding his mother's house or even taking care of Lily. It was about finding the light she had always believed in and letting it guide them both towards something better. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity, the house slowly transforming as Charles and Lily settled into their new rhythm. Charles found himself spending hours repairing creaky steps, fixing leaky faucets, and unpacking the life his mother had left behind. Each task felt like a small act of penance, a way to honor her memory by restoring the home she had loved so dearly. Lily, ever curious, followed him around, offering her own brand of quiet encouragement. Though she rarely spoke, her presence was a steady comfort, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. One afternoon, while Charles worked to clear out the clutter in the attic, Lily climbed the narrow staircase behind him. The attic was dusty and dimly lit, filled with boxes and old furniture draped in sheets. Charles was focused on opening a particularly stubborn crate when Lily wandered over to a corner where a large chest sat half-buried beneath a pile of blankets. She tugged at the lid until it creaked open, revealing an assortment of keepsakes, old letters, yellowed photographs, and a collection of ornaments carefully wrapped in tissue paper. "Look at these," Lily said, her voice tinged with awe as she held up one of the ornaments. It was a delicate glass angel, its wings shimmering faintly in the light filtering through the attic window. Charles turned, setting aside his tools to join her. He took the ornament from her hands, a wave of nostalgia washing over him. "She made this," he said softly. "Every year, she'd add a new one to the tree. Said it was her way of marking the passing time." Lily peered into the chest, her eyes wide. "There are so many," she said. "Can we use them?" Charles hesitated, the idea stirring something deep within him. The house had always come alive during Christmas, his mother's careful touches transforming every corner into a space of warmth and joy. It had been years since he'd decorated anything for the holidays, his life too consumed by deadlines and obligations to bother. But now, standing here with Lily, he realized how much he missed the simple magic of it all. "Yeah," he said finally, "let's do it." They spent the rest of the day bringing the ornaments down to the living room, unwrapping each one with care. Some were chipped or faded, but that only seemed to add to their charm. Charles found an old box of lights tucked away in the hall closet, and, to his surprise, they still worked. Together, he and Lily strung them along the walls and around the tree they'd picked out earlier in the week. By the time the sun had set, the house glowed with a soft, golden light. As they stood back to admire their work, Lily turned to Charles with a small smile. "She would have liked this, wouldn't she?" Charles nodded, his chest tightening. "Yeah," he said, "she would have." That night, they sat in the living room, the tree casting flickering shadows across the walls. Lily curled up on the couch with her stuffed rabbit, while Charles sifted through more of his mother's journals. Each page felt like a conversation with her, her words offering comfort and clarity in ways he hadn't expected. He came across one entry that made him pause, the familiar ache of regret settling in his chest. "Charles is so far away now, not just in distance but in spirit. I wish I could remind him of the boy who used to climb trees and build forts in the backyard, who believed in possibilities. I know that boy is still there, buried beneath the man he's become. I just hope he finds his way back someday." He closed the journal, his hands trembling. He had spent so much time running from the parts of himself he thought he'd outgrown, only to realize now how much he needed them. His mother had seen it all along, had never stopped believing he could be more than the sum of his mistakes. "Charles." Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see her watching him, her expression curious. "Yeah. Do you think she knew we'd be here together?" she asked. He considered her question, the weight of it settling over him. "I think she hoped for it," he said finally. "She had a way of believing in things before they happened." Lily nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I want to be like her." Charles smiled, the sincerity in her words warming something deep inside him. "You already are," he said. The days continued to unfold in quiet, meaningful ways. Charles began to venture into town, reconnecting with people he hadn't seen in years. Some greeted him warmly, others with polite indifference, their memories of his departure still fresh. But it didn't matter. He was here now, and he was determined to make amends. He visited Reverend Hall to discuss ways he could help the church, offering donations and his time. He reached out to local charities, asking how he could support their work. And through it all, Lily remained by his side, her quiet strength a constant reminder of what his mother had taught him, that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward in profound ways. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, Lily turned to him with a question that caught him off guard. "Do you think I'll ever have a family again?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Charles set down the knife he'd been using to chop vegetables, his heart twisting at the vulnerability in her voice. "Lily," he said gently, "you already have a family. Me, this house. This is your home now." Her eyes searched his face, as if looking for reassurance. "Really? Really?" he said firmly. "We're in this together." For the first time, he saw the weight lift from her shoulders, the faintest glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, a step toward healing for both of them. That night, as he watched her sleep, Charles felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He still carried the ache of loss, the regret of time wasted, but it was tempered now by the quiet joy of building something new. His mother's words echoed in his mind, a steady reminder of the path she had set him on. "Keep the light, Charles. Let it guide you." He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. Together, he and Lily would carry forward the legacy of love and hope his mother had left behind. And as the snow fell softly outside, blanketing the world in quiet beauty, Charles felt the light within him begin to grow. The snowfall grew heavier as the week went on, blanketing Asheville in a shimmering, icy beauty. Charles found himself marveling at how the town seemed to embrace the cold, its streets bustling with people bundled in scarves and coats, stopping to admire the festive lights strung across storefronts. He hadn't walked these streets in years, but now they felt oddly familiar, as if they had been waiting for him to return. Lily walked beside him, her small boots crunching through the snow. She clutched his hand tightly, her other arm wrapped around her ever-present stuffed rabbit. They were heading toward the town square, where a Christmas market had been set up. Charles had promised her they'd visit, a small way to brighten her day after the week they'd spent cleaning and organizing the house. When they reached the square, the air was alive with the sounds of carolers and the smell of roasted chestnuts. Stalls lined the area, each one adorned with twinkling lights and garlands of pine. Vendors sold handmade ornaments, knitted scarves, and jars of local honey. Lily's eyes lit up as they wandered from booth to booth, her curiosity contagious. At one stall, she stopped to admire a collection of tiny, carved wooden animals. The vendor, an older woman with kind eyes, smiled as Lily picked up a small bear. "That one's special," the woman said. "Made it myself from a piece of cherry wood. You like it?" Lily nodded shyly, holding the bear close. Charles watched her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He pulled out his wallet, but before he could pay, the vendor waved him off. "It's on me," she said, her gaze softening as it rested on Lily. "Consider it a little Christmas gift." Lily looked up at Charles, unsure, and he nodded. "What do we say?" he prompted gently. "Thank you," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. As they walked away, Charles noticed her holding the bear tightly in her hands, her steps lighter than before. It was such a small thing, but it seemed to mean the world to her. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for how easily he had once dismissed moments like this, how often he had prioritized work over connection, efficiency over joy. The market began to grow more crowded as the afternoon wore on, and Charles decided it was time to head back. They stopped at a bakery stall on their way out, picking up a loaf of fresh bread and a small box of cookies. Lily's face was dusted with powdered sugar by the time they made it to the car, her laughter filling the quiet space as Charles tried to wipe it away with a napkin. The drive back to the house was quiet, the road slick with ice. Charles took his time, his hands steady on the wheel. Lily hummed softly in the passenger seat, her new wooden bear resting on her lap. The simplicity of the day, wandering through the market, sharing small moments of happiness, felt like a gift in itself. When they arrived home, the house was warm and inviting, the soft glow of the Christmas tree welcoming them inside. They placed the bread and cookies on the kitchen counter before settling in the living room. Lily insisted on adding her new bear to the tree, and Charles helped her find the perfect spot, near one of his mother's handmade ornaments. They sat together on the couch afterward, the room bathed in the soft light of the tree. Charles picked up one of his mother's journals, flipping through the pages as Lily leaned against him, her head resting on his arm. She was quiet, her small body relaxed and warm beside him. "What are you reading?" she asked eventually, her voice muffled by his sleeve. "It's one of my mom's journals," Charles said. "She wrote about everything. Her day, her thoughts, things she hoped for." "Like what?" Lily asked, her curiosity piqued. Charles paused, skimming the page he'd stopped on. "Here's one," he said. "I hope Charles remembers how much I love him. Even when he's far away, even when he's busy, I hope he knows." His voice faltered as he read the words aloud, his chest tightening. Lily shifted, looking up at him. "Do you think she knew you'd read that?" He considered the question, his hand resting on the open journal. "Maybe," he said softly. "Or maybe she just wanted to put it out there, to make sure it was always true." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think she was really smart." "She was," Charles agreed. "She always knew what to say, even when I didn't want to hear it." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling over them. Charles set the journal aside, his hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder. It was a strange thing, this quiet connection they were building. He had never expected to find himself in this position, caring for a child, trying to piece together a life he'd long since abandoned. But it felt right in a way he couldn't explain. The days leading up to Christmas passed quickly, filled with small, meaningful moments. Charles and Lily decorated cookies, shoveled snow from the driveway, and strung lights along the porch. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, bringing gifts of homemade jams and pies, their kindness a reminder of the community his mother had been such a part of. Charles made a point to thank each of them, feeling a growing sense of responsibility to honor her memory through his actions. On Christmas Eve, Charles found himself standing in the living room, gazing at the tree as Lily played nearby. The house was quiet, save for the soft strains of holiday music playing in the background. He thought about his mother, about the life she had built in this house, and about the legacy she had left behind. It wasn't in the things she owned or the words she had written. It was in the people she had touched, the love she had given freely, without expectation. Lily approached him, holding a small wrapped package in her hands. "I made this for you," she said, her cheeks pink with shyness. Charles took the package, his chest tightening. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small drawing inside. It was simple, done in crayons, but the image was unmistakable. A tall figure with dark hair standing beside a small girl, a bright sun shining above them. "That's us," Lily said, pointing to the figures. "And that's the light she told you about." Charles stared at the drawing, his throat tight. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you, Lily." She smiled, her face lighting up in a way that made his heart ache. "Do you think she'd like it?" she asked. "I think she'd love it," Charles said. "And I think she'd be proud of both of us." As the evening wore on, they sat together by the fire, the warmth of the room a stark contrast to the cold outside. Charles felt something shift within him, a sense of peace, of belonging that he hadn't felt in years. He didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead wasn't entirely clear, but he knew one thing. They were going to be okay. Together, they would keep the light alive, just as his mother had hoped. The stillness of Christmas morning was broken by the soft sound of footsteps as Lily padded down the hallway, her small figure appearing in the doorway of Charles's room. He had left the door slightly ajar the night before, and now, as the pale light of dawn streamed through the windows, he stirred at the sound of her quiet voice. It's Christmas, she said, her tone filled with both wonder and a touch of hesitation. Charles opened his eyes, the weight of sleep still clinging to him. He sat up slowly, brushing a hand through his hair as he registered her words. "It is," he said, his voice gravelly. "Merry Christmas, Lily." She gave him a small smile, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her pajama sleeve. "Do you think there's anything under the tree?" Charles smiled softly. "There might be. Why don't we go check?" Together, they made their way to the living room. The soft glow of the Christmas tree lights illuminated the room, casting warm shadows on the walls. Charles had stayed up late the night before, wrapping a few small gifts he'd managed to pick up during their trip to the market. He'd placed them carefully under the tree, hoping to make the morning special for Lily. Her eyes widened as she saw the neatly wrapped packages. "There are presents," she exclaimed, her voice filled with delight. Charles chuckled, his heart warming at her excitement. "Go on," he said. "They're for you." Lily didn't need to be told twice. She darted toward the tree, her small hands reaching for the first package. Charles watched as she unwrapped each gift with careful precision, her face lighting up with each discovery. A set of colored pencils and a sketch pad. A soft scarf in her favorite shade of blue. A book of stories about animals, its pages filled with colorful illustrations. "These are all for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she clutched the scarf. Charles nodded, his chest tightening. "They're yours." "Merry Christmas, Lily." For a moment, she simply stared at the gifts, as if struggling to believe they were real. Then, without warning, she threw her arms around him, her small frame pressing against his. "Thank you," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "This is the best Christmas ever." Charles hugged her back, his throat tight. "You're welcome," he said softly. "You deserve it." As the morning unfolded, the house filled with the quiet sounds of laughter and conversation. Charles made breakfast, pancakes topped with powdered sugar and syrup, while Lily sat at the kitchen table, sketching in her new pad. She showed him her drawings as he cooked, each one more detailed than the last. He marveled at her talent, wondering how someone so young could already have such a strong sense of creativity. After breakfast, they bundled up in coats and scarves and stepped outside into the snow. The world was quiet and pristine, the fresh snowfall covering the yard in a glittering white blanket. Charles found an old sled in the garage, and they spent hours sliding down the small hill behind the house, their laughter echoing through the trees. For the first time in years, Charles felt a sense of unburdened joy, as if the weight he had been carrying had finally begun to lift. When they returned to the house, cheeks flushed and fingers numb from the cold, they settled by the fire with mugs of hot chocolate. Lily curled up with her new book, while Charles sifted through more of his mother's belongings. He found a box of old Christmas cards, each one carefully saved and dated, and spent the next hour reading through them. Some were from neighbors and friends, filled with news about their families and well wishes for the holiday season. Others were older, written in his father's handwriting, their tone warm and full of love. One card, however, stood out. It was tucked at the very bottom of the box, its edges worn from years of handling. Charles opened it carefully, his heart skipping a beat as he recognized the handwriting inside. "My dearest Charles, I know you're busy, and I know life has taken you far from home, but I hope you'll remember that this is always your place. No matter where you go or how much time passes, you will always belong here. Christmas is a time for love, for family, for forgiveness. It's never too late to come back on. I love always, Mama." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He could picture her writing this, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, her thoughts always on him even when he had been so distant. She had saved the card instead of sending it, perhaps hoping for a moment when the message would truly reach him. "Charles." Lily's voice broke through his thoughts. He looked up, blinking away the tears. She was watching him from across the room, her expression curious. "Are you okay?" she asked. He nodded, his throat tight. "I'm okay," he said. "Just thinking about my mom." Lily set her book aside and came to sit beside him. "She really loved you," she said. "You can tell." Charles smiled faintly, his hand resting on the card. "Yeah," he said. "She did." Lily hesitated for a moment, then rested her head against his arm. "I think she'd be happy you're here," she said quietly, "and that I'm here too." Charles wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I think so too," he said. The rest of the day passed in a peaceful blur. They cooked dinner together, the simple meal feeling more special because they'd made it themselves. Afterward, they sat by the tree, sharing stories and memories. Charles told Lily about his childhood, about the forts he'd built in the woods, the snowball fights with neighborhood kids, and the nights spent watching the stars with his mom. Lily listened intently, her wide eyes filled with wonder. As the evening wore on, the quiet warmth of the house wrapped around them like a comforting blanket. Charles felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known in years, a deep gratitude for the unexpected turn his life had taken. He thought about his mother, about the love and hope she had poured into everything she did, and he realized that this was her greatest gift to him, the chance to start again. Before bed, Lily placed her wooden bear on the mantel, next to one of Martha's favorite ornaments. "So he can be with her," she said simply. Charles nodded, his chest tightening. "That's a good idea," he said. "I think she'd like that." As he tucked Lily into bed that night, she looked up at him with a question in her eyes. "Do you think next Christmas will be like this?" she asked. Charles smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think it'll be even better," he said, "because we'll have more time to make it special." Lily nodded, her eyes heavy with sleep. "I like that," she murmured, her voice fading as she drifted off. Charles sat beside her for a while, watching her breathe. The house was quiet, the faint glow of the tree visible through the doorway. For the first time in years, he felt truly at home, not just in the house, but in himself. He thought about his mother, her words echoing in his mind, and he made a silent promise to her. He would keep the light, and he would let it guide him, one step at a time. The days following Christmas were filled with a quiet sense of purpose. Charles and Lily settled into a routine that felt both new and familiar. The house, once a place Charles had avoided for so long, began to feel alive again, its rooms filled with laughter and the small, everyday sounds of life. For Lily, it seemed like a sanctuary, something she had been missing for far too long. For Charles, it was a chance to rebuild, not just the house, but himself. One morning, Charles decided it was time to venture into town again, this time with a specific goal in mind. He wanted to learn more about the people his mother had connected with in her later years. If she had left behind a legacy in Asheville, he wanted to understand it, to continue it in her honor. Lily, bundled in her scarf and coat, was eager to join him. They started at the church, where Reverend Hall greeted them warmly. The small chapel felt different now, less a place of grief and more a space for reflection. The Reverend led Charles to a small room off the main sanctuary where a bulletin board was pinned with notes and photos from the community. "Your mother was an anchor for a lot of people here," Reverend Hall said as Charles scanned the board. "She had a way of making everyone feel seen, even when they didn't think they deserved it." Charles studied the photos on the board, recognizing his mother in many of them. In one, she stood in front of a table piled with knitted scarves and blankets, her hands outstretched as she handed one to a young woman. In another, she was laughing with a group of children, her smile wide and genuine. She ran the winter clothing drive every year, the Reverend explained. She knitted half of what we collected herself, and she was always the first to volunteer when someone needed help, be it a meal, a ride, or just someone to talk to. Charles felt a swell of pride and sadness as he listened. He had known his mother was kind, but he hadn't realized the depth of her impact. She had built something here, a legacy of compassion that touched so many lives. And yet, she had never spoken of it to him in detail, never sought recognition or praise. "Is there still a need for these programs?" Charles asked, his voice thoughtful. "There always is," Reverend Hall said, "especially this time of year. People are struggling more than ever." Charles nodded, the idea already forming in his mind. "I want to help," he said. "Whatever she was doing, I want to continue it." The Reverend smiled, a look of approval in his eyes. "I think she'd like that," he said. Over the next few days, Charles and Lily threw themselves into the effort. They began with the clothing drive, sorting through donations and setting up a collection point at the church. Charles used his resources to purchase new coats and boots, ensuring that no one would be left out. Lily helped, her small hands folding scarves and stacking boxes with care. Word spread quickly through the community, and people began to show up, both to give and to receive. Charles met neighbors he hadn't seen in years, their faces lighting up with recognition as they shook his hand. Many of them spoke of his mother, sharing stories that painted a vivid picture of the life she had built in Asheville. "She used to bake bread every Saturday and leave it on our porch," one woman said, her eyes misty. "She always said it was just a little thing, but it meant the world to us. She helped me get back on my feet after I lost my job," a man added. "Never made me feel ashamed for needing help." Each story deepened Charles's understanding of his mother, and with it, his resolve to honor her memory. He realized that the work wasn't just about giving back. It was about reconnecting, about building something that would last. Lily, too, seemed to blossom in this new environment. She grew more confident, more open, her shyness replaced by a quiet determination. She made friends with other children who came to the church, sharing her crayons and teaching them how to draw. Charles watched her with a mixture of pride and awe, marveling at how quickly she had adapted to this new life. One evening, after a long day of organizing donations, Charles and Lily sat together in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Lily was working on another drawing, her brow furrowed in concentration as she added the finishing touches. "Can I show you something?" she asked, holding up the page. Charles took the drawing, his chest tightening as he looked at it. It was a picture of the two of them standing in front of the church, surrounded by smiling people. Above them, a bright sun shone down, its rays forming a halo of light. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have such a gift, Lily." She smiled shyly, tucking her hair behind her ear. "Do you think she'd like it?" she asked. "I think she'd love it," Charles said. "And I think she'd be proud of both of us." Lily beamed, the kind of pure, unguarded joy that only a child could express. For Charles, it was a moment of clarity, a reminder of why this work mattered. It wasn't just about honoring his mother. It was about creating a future where Lily could grow up feeling safe, loved, and supported. As the evening wore on, they sat together by the fire, the warmth of the room wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. Charles felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path his life had taken, even with all its twists and turns. He thought about his mother's words, "Keep the light, let it guide you," and realized that he was finally beginning to understand what she had meant. The light wasn't just a metaphor for hope or love. It was the small, everyday actions that made a difference. The way she had shown up for her community, the way she had believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. It was a reminder that the most meaningful legacies were built not in grand gestures, but in quiet, consistent acts of kindness. As the fire burned low and the house grew quiet, Charles made a silent promise to himself and to Lily. They would keep the light alive, together, building on the foundation his mother had left them. And in doing so, they would create something that would endure, not just for themselves, but for everyone whose lives they touched. The final weeks of winter brought a sense of closure and renewal to Charles's life. The little house in Asheville, once a quiet monument to his mother's absence, now felt like a place of warmth and activity. Each day began with purpose, from organizing the clothing drive to meeting with the community to discuss other ways to help those in need. Charles found himself waking with energy he hadn't felt in years, driven by the belief that he was building something meaningful, not just for himself, but for Lily and the town his mother had loved so dearly. Lily, too, seemed to bloom in this new chapter. She had made friends at the church and had even started attending a small art class organized by one of the neighbors. Her drawings had grown more intricate and expressive, and she delighted in showing them to Charles each evening. The wooden bear she'd received at the Christmas market now sat prominently on the mantel, surrounded by the ornaments she and Charles had carefully arranged. One morning, as Charles sat at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, he noticed a folded envelope tucked under the sugar bowl. It was plain, with no markings except for his name written in his mother's neat, familiar handwriting. His chest tightened as he reached for it, carefully unfolding the paper inside. Underscore, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. But please don't let that bring you sadness. Instead, I want you to remember that my love for you has always been, and will always be, endless. I know I wasn't always the easiest person to understand, and I know you weren't always ready to hear what I wanted to tell you. But that's life, isn't it? We find our moments when we're meant to, not a second sooner. I saved this note for the right time, and I hope this is it. I hope you found your way back to yourself, to the boy who believed in wonder, and the man who was always capable of great things. You don't have to be perfect, Charles. You just have to try. That's all I ever wanted for you. To try, to care, to connect. The rest will take care of itself. Lily, if she's still with you, is part of your light now. You've always been a caretaker at heart, even if you didn't know it. Trust that instinct. Let her teach you how to see the world as I know she does, full of color and possibility. Together, you'll make something beautiful. I love you. Always under her. Charles sat for a long time, staring at the letter as tears blurred the ink. He could almost hear her voice, gentle and steady, guiding him as she had always tried to do. The weight of her words settled into his chest, not as a burden, but as a reminder of how far he had come. She had known him better than he'd ever allowed himself to admit, and she had seen this future for him long before he had. Lily appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She tilted her head, noticing the letter in his hands. "What's that?" she asked. Charles smiled faintly, wiping his eyes as he folded the letter. "Just something from my mom," he said. "A little reminder. Was she giving you advice?" Lily asked, climbing into the chair beside him. "Something like that," he said. "She was good at that." Lily nodded, resting her chin on her hand. "She was good at taking care of people too." "She was," Charles agreed. "And now it's our turn." Lily looked at him, her expression serious. "Do you think we'll be as good at it as she was?" Charles reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think we already are," he said, "and we'll keep getting better." That day, Charles and Lily set out together, their steps light despite the cold. The community clothing drive had drawn more people than expected, and they spent hours distributing coats, blankets, and other essentials to families in need. Charles noticed how Lily interacted with the other children, her quiet confidence shining as she handed out scarves and talked about her drawings. As they loaded the last box into the car at the end of the day, one of the neighbors approached Charles. She was an older woman with a kind smile and weathered hands, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "You've done something special here," she said, her voice warm. "Your mother would be so proud." Charles felt a lump rise in his throat, but he managed to smile. "Thank you," he said. "I think she'd say it was all of us." The woman nodded, patting his arm before heading back toward her car. Charles watched her go, the words settling in his heart. He glanced at Lily, who was busy helping a younger boy with his coat, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for how far they'd come. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Lily showed Charles a new drawing she had been working on. It was a picture of the two of them standing in front of the house, surrounded by the people they had met over the past few weeks. Above them, in the sky, she had drawn a bright sun with rays that seemed to reach down, connecting everything in the picture. "It's the light," she explained, pointing to the sun. Like she said. Charles studied the drawing, his chest tightening with emotion. "It's perfect," he said. "Just like she would have imagined." Lily smiled, leaning against him as they stared at the fire together. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, filled with the promise of everything they had yet to build. Charles thought about the road that had brought him here, about the choices he had made and the moments he had missed. He couldn't change the past, but he could honor it by moving forward with intention and love. As the fire burned low, he looked at Lily, her small face lit by the glow of the embers. She was his family now, his light in the darkness, just as his mother had said, and together, they would keep that light alive, letting it guide them toward a future filled with hope, connection, and the quiet magic his mother had always believed in. For the first time in a long time, Charles felt at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because it was enough. And as the snow fell softly outside, blanketing the world in quiet beauty, he knew that this was only the beginning.